Hey, welcome everybody, and thank you again for joining us. I see that we still have some folks joining, but we're going to go ahead and get started, being mindful that you're all busy people. And again, we very much appreciate you taking time out of your day for this session. So in terms of the logistics, if we can go to the next slide. Perfect, thank you. We are recording this session. Throughout the session, we're going to pause for question and answer, and we would love for you to use the chat box, and then I or my colleague Madeline Jelpy will read some of those questions aloud. If you have colleagues, friends, neighbors, anybody that you think could benefit from seeing this entire session is not only being recorded, but it will be on the public-facing part of the Out and Equal website. Logistically, I think most of us are used to Zoom at this point, but just in case, if you're having any challenges, toggling between speakers' headsets, go ahead and turn the volume up. And as always, you can reach out to us at Out and Equal at hello@outandequal.org. We'll also provide the information for our esteemed guests and collaborators that interact in the chat box as well. So I'm Deena Fidas, my pronouns are she and her, and I have the pleasure of serving as Out and Equal's Managing Director and also our Chief Program and Partnerships Officer. Kimberly's going to introduce herself in just a few minutes, but before that, I wanted to let you all know just how extraordinary it is to have Kimberly on the line today. Kimberly Zieselman is the Executive Director at Interact. She is a globally known attorney and human rights activist, and she has also just published a memoir that I consider essential reading. It's entitled XOXY, and I think we're going to put that in the chat box as well. Kimberly, on a personal note, I probably haven't even told you this in our conversations. I have known Kimberly for a few years in our global LGBTQI movement and advocacy roundtables. And on a personal note, I want to thank you for your advocacy, but also your generosity of spirit. It is not only not easy, it really can take a toll, I think. Being the lone voice to talk about intersex inclusion and having to both bring people in and engage them and also diplomatically let them know how, some of these very roundtables have not been serving the intersex community or intersex advocacy as well as, frankly, we all can. And I have always admired that about you and appreciated the kindness, the compassion, and also just the clarity of what it means to all move towards full equality. So thank you so much from my heart and also from my head in terms of being an advocate. Thank you for being with us. And again, for those joining us after you hear some of the nuts and bolts of intersex awareness and advocacy, I hope you will check out Kimberly's memoir because it's an extraordinary perspective. So quickly, why are we gathered here today? If I told you that lawmakers around the world, that major global employers, that advocates were fundamentally misunderstanding or even ignoring the needs of a population larger than the population of Japan, you'd probably be stunned. It probably would not even sound realistic. And yet that is precisely where we are for individuals with intersex variation or those who identify as intersex. And while it's a good soundbite to say the moment is now, the moment was really a long time ago. But we have the opportunity today to accelerate our shared understanding of intersex advocacy, to accelerate what has really proven to be an extraordinary opportunity for inclusion, and that's the work of inclusive workplaces, inclusive organizations, and inclusive companies. And so we absolutely have the opportunity to change things so that the next generation of memoirs won't have some of the pain and the challenges that advocates like Kimberly have been through. We also are we are exactly a week away from Global Intersex Awareness Day. We have partnered Out and Equal and Interact on what we think is the first of its kind employer-ready resource, looking at everything from foundational knowledge on intersex inclusion to those concrete steps. You know, just as for many of you, you've probably had to sit down with someone and say, how can we become more LGBTQ inclusive? Well, how can we become intersex inclusive? Very literally, what does it mean for a non-discrimination policy? What are the implications for our benefits, our employee resource group? So the resource has all of that. And then today is really that sneak peek or that preview as to the content. And you know, you can always talk to Deena Fidas or Out and Equal. You don't always get Kimberly Zieselman here. So please do light up the chat box. You are in the presence of a truly extraordinary advocate. So with that, again, thank you, Kimberly, and thank you to your entire organization for your partnership on this important resource. I'm going to turn to you now, and I think I will go off camera for a few minutes.
Thank you so much, Deena. That was such a lovely, heartwarming introduction. It is really significant to me that we are here today, a week before Intersex Awareness Day this year, and so many of you are taking the time out of your busy days to learn about intersex. I think that fact alone illustrates to me how far we've come over the last decade in raising awareness about intersex. And I'm thrilled to say that more and more people are starting to at least ask the good questions about what is intersex and what do I need to know. And so thank you for being here today. As Deena said, I am an intersex woman and also the director of Interact Advocates. I am also a mom and a wife and an attorney, and all of those things I bring to my work advocating for the intersex community. And I think the first thing I'd like to do, if we could go to the next slide, is just talk about the definition of intersex to make sure that we're all operating off of the same page around our understanding of what is intersex. So intersex is truly a very broad umbrella term, and it refers to a person who's born with one or more physical sex characteristics, such as genitals, chromosomes, or internal reproductive organs that don't match up with what is typically thought of as either a male or a female body. There are about 40 different intersex conditions and varieties. Some are more common than others. For example, I am intersex and I was born with XY chromosomes, which are thought to be typically male chromosomes. No uterus or ovaries, but instead I had internal testes. A person's intersex status is sometimes discovered immediately upon birth. About 1 in 2,000 of all births are these types of births, where it's an intersex child whose genitals don't look quite what we'd expect for either a male or a female. Or it can be, commonly it's discovered later on during puberty, or what should be puberty or expected as a puberty experience, or even later, such as when somebody is trying to get pregnant. So for example, in my case, my intersex status was not discovered until my young teens, when I failed to get a period and was taken to the doctor, who ran tests and made a diagnosis of androgen insensitivity syndrome. Okay, go to the next slide. So intersex is not new, as intersex people have existed throughout history and within all cultures. However, intersex people for a long time have been very invisible due to the shame and the stigma and, frankly, the erasure that has been put upon us by society. Actually, nearly 2% of the population are born with one or more intersex traits, which is more common than the birth of identical twins. And as Deena said, it's about the same number as the entire population of Japan. Next slide. Although intersex is not a sexual orientation or even a gender identity, it is increasingly being added to the broader queer umbrella due to the intersex community's shared experiences of oppression and discrimination in society simply because we are viewed as being different or not normal. And just like homophobia or transphobia, at its core, this is based on the fear of difference. In the case of intersex folks, we're discriminated against and harmed based on others' fear of bodily difference. Intersex people may have a variety of gender identities and sexual orientations, just like the rest of the population. Next slide. So while intersex folks may share a common allyship with the broader LGBTQ plus community, it's also important to understand what makes intersex status different from LGBTQ identity. First, intersex people are born, as I said, with physical sex characteristics that make their bodies non-binary. Often these physical differences are noticed by parents or doctors way before the intersex person themselves is aware of their differences, and thus their intersex status. So most importantly, this particularly makes intersex children, intersex babies, very vulnerable to harmful, non-consensual, and irreversible medical interventions in an attempt to fix their bodies to fit the notions of what is, quote, normal for either a male or a female. In essence, attempting to erase our intersex status before we are even old enough to talk. The majority of these surgeries happen to children under the age of 2. These harmful and non-consensual medical interventions have been deemed a form of torture in medical settings by the United Nations and has been named human rights violations by just about, has been named a human rights violation by just about every LGBTQ org that's looked at this issue and every single human rights org that's considered it. Next slide, please. And finally, just a note about language. Intersex people generally prefer to use self-defined terminology to describe themselves and their experiences, while some folks, including myself, prefer intersex and use the term intersex. I often say I'm an intersex woman, for example. Not all do, and it's important to remember that. Some prefer to use the label or the name given their underlying medical diagnosis, such as I am a woman with androgen insensitivity syndrome. Some use the more general medical terminology, difference or disorder of sex development. However, most folks in the community have rejected that disorder of sex development language as just simply being too pathologizing and not helpful in our efforts to end or delay medical intervention until we're able to have a voice in the matter. In the not so recent past, sadly, the term hermaphrodite was carelessly used to describe people like myself. Today, it's considered offensive by most. However, a small minority in the intersex population community do use the word to describe themselves as a way of reclaiming the power in the word. But the bottom line is the best practice, as always, is simply to ask someone what language they prefer. So I think now we're going to pause for questions. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Kimberly. I think actually the first question, I believe, came in just as I was speaking, and I had said those with intersex variation or those who identify as intersex. And I think what I was trying to draw out there is exactly what you just described, that some people will prefer to describe their intersex variation with slightly more medical terms, and others really welcome intersex as in I am part of the intersex community, I'm intersex. I'm not sure if there's more to this question in the chat box, but it says, is intersex condition something that you can, emphasis on can, self-identify as?
Sure. I mean, someone can identify as being intersex if they in fact are intersex, right? So if they were born with one or more of those physical sex characteristics, it doesn't, you know, they don't necessarily have to have validation by their doctors, although I think most people do. Mm-hmm. But certainly folks who are intersex can claim that as an identity if they so choose. However, folks that don't have intersex characteristics should not claim that identity because they're not intersex.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kimberly. And there's a question. You had mentioned a term that could be considered more pathologizing. Do you mind repeating that? Somebody would like a little more clarity here.
Sure. So the term that was coined in about 2006 by a bunch of medical professionals is disorder of sex development, commonly referred to as DSD. And that term is something that most of the intersex community, certainly the activist community, has pushed back against as being just too pathologizing. But it is something that you may commonly hear, particularly in medical circles.
Thank you. And if I may hopefully help further contextualize some of, or draw out, I think, some of what you've presented, Kimberly, having worked in this movement and particularly spent a lot of time on effecting change when it comes to trans healthcare coverage and the terminology and education within companies around trans, non-binary identities. Listening to you, a few things jumped out. How many of us either ourselves experience this or colleagues or friends and family tell us that, hey, when the doctor declared boy or girl, that's the very decision that I didn't get to take part in, and now I have to, quote, come out as transgender. I have to clarify my gender identity. And so there's commonality here. It's not the same, but there's commonality in terms of all that happens from that first. Sometimes it's just a glimpse by the doctor of a baby, and that there is so much that we can do together to further our common understanding, but also to help clarify the distinctions here. I know we're going to talk more about this, but if you walk away with maybe nothing else right now, besides the fact that we need to do more for intersex inclusion, intersex variation, intersex identity, gender identity and expression, and sexual orientation are all distinct. And we all possess those. We can, so for some of us, there's alignment in terms of our physicality at birth, the gender identity and expression ascribed to us, and our sexual orientation. But for most of us, there is variation across that spectrum. And so I'm going to now turn, there's a great question here. Has the American Academy of Pediatrics taken a stand on educating doctors on not performing unnecessary surgeries on intersex babies? There's also a note for everybody that I think is helpful. There's apparently a documentary someone found very eye-opening, which is called Gender Revolution.
Sure. So Gender Revolution, I think that I know that was hosted by Katie Couric a couple of years ago. And I think 3/4 of it focused on the trans community, but about 1/4 of it focused on the intersex community. And it was very well done. And I recommend folks watching that. It used to be available for free on Netflix. I'm not sure if it is anymore. But your other question was, remind me?
Sorry, has the American Academy?
Oh, the Academy, of course. So the Academy has not. And that's not because we haven't been asking. The medical profession, the Academy of Pediatrics is a great, professional body that really should be stepping up and talking about this. We are working as advocates and as community members with folks, particularly on the LGBTQ committees, not surprisingly, at that organization to try to make some headway. Intersex Awareness Day is October 26th every year. It's coming up, and it's an international day of recognition. And that date goes back 21 years in history now to when the first known intersex activists protested outside of the American Academy of Pediatrics conference in Boston. And so Intersex Awareness Day today is really commemorating that date in history. And still we're waiting for them to make a statement against these surgeries, but I have hope.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kimberly. And something else that I think is a foundational question, which is why is it so important to make one's being intersex public knowledge?
I think it's a really personal choice. I don't think it's necessarily important. Every individual's situation is different. I found it helpful to me personally to come out as intersex and claim that part of my identity. And for obvious reasons, I mean, obviously, I've made it into a life's work as well. But it really is a matter of being private. I think, however, if I could persuade more folks who are, have a situation that allows them to be safely out as intersex, I would persuade them to try to do so, because the more out intersex people are, the more general knowledge there is about us as a community, and the less fear there is about what intersex means and the fear of non-binary bodies. So one of the reasons that I wrote my memoir that Deena so nicely referred to, XOXY, is because I really wanted a narrative out there that folks could relate to. So as someone who is intersex and very much in allyship with the broader queer community, I myself do not identify as queer. So I also thought that it coming from, a cis, suburban housewife, right, could help build some bridges. And I think that's what we need, is the more people feel empowered. And I'm seeing this in the younger generation, 100%. Younger folks are starting to come out and identify as intersex and be really proud of it. And that is due to the work that, people before me and others have been advocating for over the last couple of decades.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. We have several more questions for you. I think in order to get through the content, I'll use a fast clip for my part, and then we'll come back to you, Kimberly, and then there are definitely more questions for you. One comment that I want to draw out based on what you just said, someone very generously offered, I agree with the privacy as a trans man for exactly the same reason. People need to know and see that trans and intersex people exist, and you can't tell just by looking at us, but we are here and useful members of society. I think I would also offer, as we now turn to making workplaces more inclusive, to me, there are very clear imperatives here of things that need to change in the workplace to make them more equitable for the intersex population. There's also this factor, though, of what does it mean to truly have cultures of belonging? And when you have cultures of belonging, you don't have to think twice about sharing something that is essential to your life's experience. We were, I say the royal we, answering questions about, well, why do you need to tell people about, your orientation in the workplace? It's not to tell somebody about, inappropriate things. It's to let them into the fullness of our lives. Oh, I moved to Boston because my first girlfriend was here, or, my daughter XYZ. And I think, depending on a person's comfort level, trust, and the relevance to anyone's situation, my hope is that people can talk about their intersex identity or their intersex variation without having to give it a second thought, without having to wonder, oh, now will I be the subject of gossip or stereotypes? Will somebody look at me differently? At the end of the day, that's part of the goal. So with that, let's talk concretely, though, because there are structural elements of the workplace that need to be revisited in this specific context. So first, again, just as so many of you as advocates have sat down with your ERG executive champion or your chief human resource officer and said, hey, we need to get more LGBTQ inclusive, and this is how we need to do it. So let's go to that bedrock of workforce inclusion, which is the non-discrimination policy. There's some nuance here. Number one, important for everyone to know that your organizations are liable to protect people from discrimination on the basis of intersex status. The reason they're liable is that intersex we would all assert is a covered category under non-discrimination provisions that prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex. Reminder too that we just had this major victory in the Bostock case and the related decisions on Title VII protections, ostensibly under sex, but covering as well and inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, similarly, and that being said, we encourage companies to have still clear language so that the entire workforce understands the expectations on the job, to have clear language that includes sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. In a similar fashion, it is a best practice to explicitly include the language that sex characteristics, not just sex, but sex characteristics, are also covered under your organization's non-discrimination policy. And then again, this, some of the questions in the chat box being a testament to this. Let's go to the next slide here. We know that your diversity, equity, and inclusion, your HR, your trainings and education really do need to be inclusive of intersex and clarify. My guess is from the chat box and those of us that have tuned in, very few of us would ace a quiz on the fundamentals of intersex identity and inclusion. And when it comes to the workplace, it's absolutely imperative that managers understand this, that colleagues understand this, and it's our role then to equip them with the education and the materials that they need. And so go ahead, build in those definitions. You can have a non-discrimination policy articulated and just simply asterisk or put in parentheticals those definitions so that there is that level of clarity. You also want to make sure, and this is very, just structural changes, ensure that wherever you're placed in an organization, you have access, whether it's to the intranet or other common areas of collateral and education, that you can pull those resources up. It's also vital that you maintain strict confidentiality in managing employees' personal data. For example, if someone who reports to me comes to me and tells me about their intersex variation, and perhaps there's some medical leave that the individual may need, and they simply want to, as their manager, give me the heads up and give me the fullness of understanding of what they're going through, I would retain the confidentiality of that information just as I would any other medical condition or medical information that someone chooses to tell me. I would also say, while it's not on this slide, when in doubt, ask and educate yourself. That doesn't mean when in doubt, ask the only intersex person you know for every answer. It means when in doubt, if someone says to you, I have intersex variation, that person may be signaling to you, I don't necessarily identify as intersex and identify as sort of part of this large community, but I am telling you something about myself. So take your cues from other people, just as you do when it comes to other elements of self-identity. Let's go to the next slide. This is a big one, employer-provided health insurance. It is essential that managers understand what is covered in their organization. It's also essential that benefits leads and human resource professionals are communicating with their insurers or their third-party administrators. I'm using wonky language for a reason. It's because this is a limited pool of people who are actually dealing with the Cignas, the Aetnas, the Blue Cross Blue Shields of the world. But you do need to understand, one, have we mitigated any exclusions to continuing care and coverage? This is a direct extension, a direct relation to all of the hard work that's been done on trans-inclusive healthcare coverage. It's also a moment for a call to action. You heard Kimberly refer to non-consensual surgeries of newborns, of babies, procedures that have been deemed torture by certain international bodies. And there is an opportunity to clarify with your insurance provider as to whether or not perhaps your organization inadvertently is covering that care. We know that medical care is highly personal. And we are not suggesting that employers advise on medical care per se, but employers do absolutely have a role in reviewing their own plan offerings, ensuring that no one is left behind, whether because they're intersex, they're non-binary, they're trans, and also ensuring that you are not inadvertently providing coverage for something that runs counter to other medical expertise. We'll go to the next slide. The dress code in facilities. This to me is a fabulous reminder again that intersex variation in identity, sexual orientation, and gender are all distinct. And yet one point of commonality is that absolutely we encourage all companies, if you have dress codes, there is no need for those dress codes to rely on old gender stereotypes. It is perfectly within your realm to look at dress codes as they relate to the visibility of logos, the visibility of lanyards identifying yourself as an employee, for example. You know, whether or not someone wears the hat when they're at a cashier, or you know, the degree of formality, you know, that there's an expectation, for example, of, you know, business as opposed to casual dress in certain client meetings. Notice I could talk about all of those without mentioning somebody's gender. This is above and beyond the subject at hand when it comes to intersex or LGBTQ inclusion. We know that millennials and those younger who are filling up the ranks of organizations strongly reject these gender stereotypes. And so I would say that this is a good reminder of that. Now, when it comes to facilities, we are talking about bodily diversity. Now, bodily diversity, for those that have, for example, you're a pharma company, you're a manufacturing plant, you have locker rooms, you have these facilities, it is always a best practice, even if you have shared areas in which individuals are not clothed, locker rooms and such, it's always advisable to have an option for somebody to use a private curtained area to change. That can be for tradition, cultural, religious preferences. That can be because of bodily diversity. And when we talk about bodily diversity, we're not just talking about intersex. We're not just talking about trans and queer people. We could be talking about a cisgender woman who's had a double mastectomy and her preference is to be in that private location. So there are a lot of reasons to ensure that even in these shared areas where you may not have space for everybody to have their own specific changing room, that you do provide some options there. Let's go to the next one. Okay, now some fundamentals of allyship. As you all probably know, we will rarely give you a palm card of the exact 5 things that you need to be an ally. Instead, it's a framework. And as part of that framework, here are some reminders in the context of intersex identity. Number 1, don't assume everyone shares the same physical traits or bodily experiences, such as having a menstrual period or the ability to become pregnant. This is a good reminder in the workplace. Now, some of you hearing that might think, oh, who's talking about their, menstrual period in the workplace? Well, it's amazing how these assumptions and these casual references have a way of cropping up, whether it's a woman turning to another woman colleague saying, oh, I always get headaches this time of the month, don't you? Well, not necessarily. And again, that could be because that person has intersex variation. It could be because she's postmenopausal. It could also be because she just doesn't want to bond with you over that experience. So there are a lot of reasons to disrupt those stereotypes or those assumptions. Always let someone share information with you. People give you cues, people take contextual cues, and it matters. Is someone sharing this with you and they don't need anything from you, they're just sharing? Or is it someone who's reported to you for 12 years and has to take medical leave? Or is it somebody who reports to you, or you yourself are a manager, and you are confronting some challenges because unbeknownst to you, your baby, your child, had these very surgeries happen, and now you're having to unwind this and accelerate medical and maybe therapeutic care for a child. So just the full range of ways that people need to share information in the workplace, keep that in mind when it comes to allyship and intersex identity. I think it's also vital, this last point about educating yourself. It's that balance of learning from first-person accounts, such as the one that Kimberly shares, but also doing your own reading, understanding your own, if you had any reference points before this call or before learning about intersex, unpacking the elements of that that aren't serving you or intersex colleagues well. As I then pass the baton back to Kimberly to round us out, I think, are we due for our next Q&A now? Or yes, there we go. Something that jumped out at me in the chat box that perhaps we can offer some additional clarity now. We have been, both our organizations, Interact and Out and Equal, been getting very well-meaning questions from people that say, should we add the I? In other words, we keep seeing LGBTQI in our global networks. Is it time for us to add the I? I would respectfully offer that I'm going to answer that question with a question, which is, has your organization taken on the foundational learning and the foundational steps, such as those that we've just outlined, to become LGBTI inclusive? It's okay if the answer is no, but now's the time to do that. And so, yes, raise visibility, take steps to engage people on intersex inclusion. But just as you would not have claimed that you're trans inclusive prior to having gender identity in a policy, prior to doing the work that needed to be done, the same goes for LGBTQI. And so let the substance happen first, and then more of that external communication. But in that vein, it is time to raise that visibility. And we have several calls to action that I know Kimberly's going to go over in a moment. Let me also glance, though, at the Q&As here. We've got about 20 minutes together. Okay. Okay, here's a question, and I think it's kind of to underscore this. It says, how does intersex fit in with the rest of the LGBTQIA alphabet soup? For instance, most of these letters describe sexual preference. I think we would all agree that that's typically sexual orientation. When we talk about these topics, we also talk about gender identity or expression. Does intersex fall under gender identity as well, or does it focus primarily on biology?
I am happy to answer that. So intersex is not a gender identity, nor of course is it a sexual orientation. But what I often say is the reason I and many other people feel that the I belongs in the alphabet soup is because of the similar experiences around oppression and discrimination and hate based on difference, right? So it's more of a shared experience. And my experience has been that folks in the broader queer community in the alphabet soup who are not intersex are much more able to get it when intersex people talk about their experiences, right? They have been, I've been so grateful for the number of LGBTQ plus allies who have stepped up on behalf of intersex folks over the last, few years. Internationally, this has been happening a little longer, but here in the US, it's starting to happen now as well. And I think that is a great thing. Another thing that may help you to think about this is when I talk about the biggest issue really for the intersex community right now, the biggest human rights issue is these medically unnecessary surgeries that are happening on babies and children that they can't consent to. So in a way, you can think of this as a form of conversion therapy. However, it's done to children who are very young, who don't even have a voice and haven't even self-identified in any certain way yet. But it's a way to sort of erase the intersexness out of us before we're able to even embrace it ourselves. And so it's sort of another form of conversion therapy. So I think there are examples like that that some folks in the broader queer community can really relate to. But you're absolutely right. It's not a gender identity or a sexual orientation. However, I will just add that there are some intersex people that do claim intersex as their gender identity.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Mhm.
Somebody else has asked about broadly how we educate our organization on inclusive language. I might offer that that's precisely why we've put our heads together, our organizational heads together on this upcoming resource. But if you have any other suggestions, Kimberly, on sort of those first steps of education within a particular company or organization.
Sure. Well, I think the Out and Equal guide that will be out next week for Intersex Awareness Day is a fabulous start, and will be a really great resource. I think, even as a first step, just starting to talk about it with other people, or even something as simple as following Interact and other intersex advocacy organizations on social media, liking, retweeting things. Next Monday is Intersex Awareness Day. There'll be a lot of opportunity for that. Is a really good first step. Inclusion, I think, starts with a sense of belonging and creating a sense of belonging. So just letting kind of folks know that you're open to that, and it may be something as simple as retweeting on Monday, I think is a really good first step.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. I'm going to ask one more question on here before we move to this next section on the action items. What guidance can you offer people who identify as intersex for communicating their identity with their coworkers and manager?
So again, it's a personal decision, but I think the more resources we have available, the better for folks. So if I was to advise an intersex person about how to disclose to their managers in a workplace, I would probably suggest that they share some materials, that are really clear and describe what intersex is. So all the work isn't necessarily put on the intersex person themselves, because inevitably an intersex person is still unfortunately unable to just walk up to somebody and say, "Hi, I'm intersex," and expect that person to understand what it means. So, sharing, the soon to be published guide from Out and Equal, or sharing a fact sheet from Interact's website. We do have a website with a resources tab that has a number of different fact sheets and brochures that could be helpful to both employers and employees.
Mm-hmm. And I might offer broadly that identifying, and I think this is related to sharing any information at work. Identifying for yourself why you are sharing the information can also help the dialogue along. Sometimes you're sharing information because you simply want someone to know where you're coming from as a human being. Sometimes you're sharing information because there's been a problem. Maybe you overheard an inappropriate remark or a joke, and it stung particularly because you are intersex. It shouldn't happen anyway, but maybe you need to share that and say, you didn't know this about me, but that really was not only inappropriate, it hurt me. It may also be that you need to inquire about medical benefits, whether for yourself or your dependents. And so I think sometimes if it is a conversation where you're doing your own prep, I might ask myself, and then you can also help the person along by saying, "I'm telling you this because I trust you," or "I'm telling you this because we're friends." Or you might be saying, "I'm telling you this because I'm going to need your support in talking with our HR or benefits team about this." So to that end, I would also offer the person asking this, if this is an experience you're having, please do stay in touch with us. We want to support you, and let us know how it goes. Because unfortunately, for a lot of managers, this might be the first time that they're hearing this and they may not get it right. We'd love to stay in touch with you, and thank you for offering that. So with that, I think, we've got about a little less than 15 minutes left. And I know, Kimberly, you were going to wrap us up with some calls to action.
Sure. Next slide, please. So things that you can do in the immediate future would be, of course, reading and sharing the guide that will be out soon. You can also join Interact's new corporate Intersex Allies group. There is a bit.ly link here in the slide, and folks can always email me directly if you want to get hooked up. But it's a growing new group of folks that we will keep in the loop around intersex in the workplace type issues specifically. You can follow us on social media at interact_ADV. Tweet out in support of intersex employees on Intersex Awareness Day is another great call to action for the immediate future. Next slide, please. I already spoke about Intersex Awareness Day. Next slide, please. Specifically, here are a couple of examples of tweets you can use on Monday if you'd like to show support and raise awareness around intersex, and as well as a graphic around supporting intersex employees that Out and Equal has, of course, and Interact has, and we're happy to share that file with you if you'd like to use it on social media or retweet or share what you see on our social media. And I think that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Kimberly. And in our time left, I think we do have an opportunity to answer a few more questions. As my colleague Madeline is selecting which ones to bubble up, I want to briefly summarize for everybody that, this is the first of what we hope to be many conversations. And a year from now, as we are gearing up for Intersex Awareness Day 2021, we want to be working with you. I know Interact wants to be working with you. We can do it together to ensure that there's measurable change over this next year. Committing to action now will get us those results in the coming months. And so I hope I didn't offer too much nuance with this idea of what can we do now. It is absolutely appropriate to begin the conversation next week or this week in advance of Intersex Awareness Day. And we would encourage you to be authentic. Be authentic if you are in fact at the beginning of that journey. So don't feel that you can't acknowledge Intersex Awareness Day without having taken these steps. I think what we are saying is, proceed with caution when it comes to just adding I, because for that parent of an intersex child or that employee who's intersex, if they see that, then perhaps their level of expectation is going to be here, but you're not actually ready for that. So now is definitely the time to begin this. I would also say, and I've had this conversation 1,000 times in my career. Well, we don't seem to have any transgender people here. We would know if we had a transgender person. We would know if we had somebody who's intersex. Statistically, it is highly unlikely that your organizations do not have intersex people within them, or the family members of your employees, that there are intersex family members of employees. Statistically, you have this form of diversity, but you haven't necessarily had the tools to become more inclusive and really foster cultures of awareness and belonging for intersex people. So thank you. Kimberly has been generous enough to share her direct line. I hope people don't totally blow that up. Also, Interact's resources. We're going to follow up with everybody in the chat box, everybody who's part of this seminar today, with the tools, with the resource when it's ready, and to also reshare this presentation so that you can have those social media tips. So Madeline, I'm switching now to the Q&A, and like you said, we have time for a few more. Okay, here's a very more technical question. Is it more accurate to include intersex education more with our company's disability special emphasis group, since they are a group experiencing discrimination based on medical/biological differences from historical norms? Very, very good technical question there.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. There is certainly an intersection between the intersex rights movement and the disability rights movement. So I do not think it would be inappropriate. It sort of depends on the culture and kind of your corporation and where folks are at. To date, I can say that the momentum has been more within the LGBTQ equality kind of umbrella, where we have found our best results of getting inclusion. You know, I think some in the intersex community may argue that it's a little bit too pathologizing to go the disability rights kind of angle. I'm not so sure that I agree with that 100%. I think it can work, but it's a great question, and I think it really depends on sort of the environment that you're working within and where the momentum is.
Thank you so much. And also a friendly reminder to everybody on this call that as we collectively advocate, for example, for access to trans medical coverage, we are simultaneously fighting back the pathologizing of gender identity. You know, in the DSM, you're still seeing language, or we have historically seen language of, quote, gender identity disorder. And so we as a movement, I think we are primed to hold this complexity. You know, yes, we may need to frame this for a particular legal goal or a particular health insurance goal, but it doesn't mean that socially and culturally we want to reiterate language that pathologizes anybody's gender identity, intersex identity, or sexual orientation. I think as maybe one of our last questions here, I really love this question because I think we're talking to one, but the question is, hi, I'm wondering if the intersex community has shared stories of its own heroes in the way that the larger queer community has.
I think that's a goal. I think raising more awareness and by sharing more narratives from intersex folks is one of the ways that we are going to make change and change hearts and minds around inclusion and around supporting bodily autonomy for intersex people as children, all of those things. I am only one intersex person speaking out. There are actually now many, and there were intersex people speaking out long before I was. And there are a number of intersex people who are younger than me who are now starting to speak out. Some of them are on social media, some of them are making films, some maybe even writing books. So I think we're going to see more and more of these narratives in the media. Certainly, that's my hope, and I've seen just a great increase just in the last 4 or 5 years. It's been phenomenal. So to be continued, but thanks for the question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I think actually there is one left, and this may be an opportunity to hear from you, Kimberly, on beyond the workplace, what else Interact does and any other, you know, sibling organizations. This person says that knowing a close friend and how the medical profession is, even in major metro areas, that they're not educated about the intersex community and even mistakes people who are intersex as transgender. The question is, do you know what is actively being done to educate those in the medical field who should hopefully be educating themselves about the community? So who's out there at the school
Right.
and at the annual conferences saying this has to change?
Right. So Interact is the largest intersex affirming organization, intersex-led organization in the United States, actually in the world. We have a whopping 6 employees and a $500,000 total budget. So it just gives you a sense of the how nascent our movement is. I mean, we've been making great strides, but we are small and the movement is very underfunded. Having said that, there are folks, including Interact and others, who are and have been for years trying to work directly with the medical community to change medical practice, both at the association level, like the AAP, but also within different institutions or private practices with differing levels of success. So I think I do feel that medical school curriculum, for example, is going to start including some more about providing, competent care for intersex people, just like it has started to in some places around LGBTQ care. It is something that people are starting to talk about. It's not uncommon for doctors who don't specialize in this area to not understand what intersex is, sadly. And intersex people, by and large, are really put in the position, particularly as adults out in the world, just living and going through regular, healthcare needs, to have to explain and educate all of our doctors. However, Interact has been working with the Fenway Institute in Boston, associated with Fenway Health Center, an LGBTQ health center, and we've just put out a new guide for primary care physicians around providing affirming care for the intersex community. So that's really exciting. It's the first of its kind. So more and more of these types of initiatives and trainings are hopefully going to be happening in association with different health centers that are starting to become kind of pioneers in this area and recognizing the need, not only on the policy level, but also just in the actual clinical setting, to provide competent care for intersex adults who, by and large, have been walking around without any specific place to go. So it's a great question, and I do feel hopeful that we're at this tipping point right now where things are starting to shift. So it's exciting.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you so much. I think it's always grounding to reflect on our commonalities across the LGBTQI spectrum of experiences. And so much of our community's movement and advocacy has been on naming and unlearning and unpacking those ideas. And in this case, the physical trauma foisted on us, whether as babies, as young people. And, we have an opportunity to change. And so I really appreciate all of you that spent time with us today. If I could ask just one thing of the now 120 plus that are on right now, if you do nothing else, tell somebody what you just did for an hour. Tell someone that you just spent an hour learning about intersex inclusion in the workplace. And the seed I hope that plants is that parent who wasn't sure who they could talk to about this experience knows that you might be a safe space, or that colleague that has, wondered where they fit, who can they talk to, who can they share with. If the first time they hear the words intersex brought up, it's in a respectful, kind way, and it's from someone who took time out of their day to educate themselves, that can really fundamentally change relationships and in some cases change lives. So I really urge all of you to do that. Thank you again to Kimberly and your entire team at Interact. We're going to be sharing this resource and the ability for all of you to stay connected directly to Kimberly and Interact. And with that, thank you. And on the heels of Intersex Awareness Day, I am hopeful that we can in fact be the ones we're waiting for. We can be the change that we need. So thank you again, Kimberly. Thank you all. Kimberly, any last comments before we close out?
Just thank you. Thank you, Deena. Thank you, Out and Equal. And thank you all for participating. Happy Intersex Awareness Day.